In a small town in Texas, there was a boy named Jake Peterson. He grew up in a hardworking family. His dad was a mechanic at a repair shop, and his mom worked as a cashier at a local grocery store. They weren't wealthy, but they did everything they could to give Jake a good life and a solid education. Jake wasn't lazy, but he had one big flaw: he hated failure. Since he was little, he avoided challenges if he wasn't sure he could succeed. If a math problem was too hard, he'd give up. If his basketball team lost, he'd blame the referee or his teammates. Every time he failed, he felt ashamed, and instead of learning from his mistakes, he chose to run from them. His parents often reminded him, "Son, life isn't just about winning. What matters is what you learn from losing." But Jake never really listened. He figured he could get by without changing. That all changed when he was 16. He entered a statewide science competition with a project on fuel-efficient engines. He worked for months, pouring everything into it, convinced he would win. But when the results were announced, he didn't even place. It felt like his whole world had come crashing down. Jake walked out of the auditorium with a heavy heart. He had imagined standing on stage, holding a trophy, hearing the applause. But now, he was just another contestant who didn't make the cut. For days, he beat himself up over it. He felt embarrassed and even thought about giving up on science altogether. He blamed the judges, the competition, even bad luck. Then, one afternoon, his dad called him out to the garage. He handed Jake a wrench and pointed at their old pickup truck. "This truck has broken down more times than I can count, but I never just gave up on it. I figure out what's wrong, fix it, and every time, it runs a little better. Science works the same way, son. You can't expect to get it perfect on the first try. If you don't learn from failure, you'll never get anywhere." Jake stood there, speechless. For the first time, he stopped making excuses and started analyzing what went wrong. Looking back at his project, he saw so many flaws: miscalculations, and inefficient design. He finally understood, failure wasn't the end. It was a lesson, a step forward. Up until that moment, Jake had always blamed circumstances when things went wrong. His teacher didn't explain well enough, his teammates didn't play hard enough, luck wasn't on his side. But now, he couldn't ignore the facts. His mistakes were clear. He hadn't double-checked his calculations, he hadn't tested different approaches, and worst of all, he had been overconfident in an idea that wasn't fully developed. Realizing this was humbling, but instead of feeling discouraged, Jake felt something new: motivation. He thought about what his dad said about fixing cars: if you don't find the problem and fix it, the car will never run. His project was the same. It wasn't a total failure, it just wasn't finished yet. So instead of sulking, Jake took action. He went back to his notes, studied engine mechanics, and even reached out to a university professor for advice. Each mistake he uncovered felt less like a setback and more like progress. Over time, he realized that taking responsibility for failure didn't make him weak, it made him stronger. In the following months, Jake threw himself into his work with a completely new mindset. Before, he would give up when things got tough. Now, he pushed through. He started reading books on engineering, paying close attention to how his dad fixed cars, and asking experts for feedback instead of trying to figure everything out alone. For the first time, he wasn't afraid to fail. Instead of seeing mistakes as proof that he wasn't good enough, he saw them as part of the process. He learned to ask himself, what did I do well? What didn't work? How can I improve? That shift changed everything. A year later, he came back to the same competition with a new version of his project, stronger, smarter, and more refined. He still didn't know if he'd win, but that didn't matter anymore. Because now, he understood that success wasn't about never failing, it was about learning, growing, and never giving up.